I've been curious about Hegel lately and how he views religion and all that. So I have a Žižek article here, The Fall That Makes Us Like God. The singularity cannot keep its theological promise to redeem us from the fall. It may so happen that in post-humanity we will move into another dimension in which we will no longer be fallen, constrained to our finitude. But this does not mean that we will be redeemed in the sense of reuniting ourselves with some dimension experienced as divine. This, however, also does not mean that the topic of theology has to be left behind. On the contrary, the notion of the fall deserves a closer examination. So let's begin at the beginning. We all know the description of Genesis 3. I don't have the top of my head. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit in the trees in the garden, but God did not say, 'You will not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' You will not certainly die." The serpent said to the woman, "For God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened. Eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. But she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. And so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate it." After cursing the serpent, God turns to the woman. To the woman he said, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." To Adam he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate the fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil will you eat food from it all days of your lives. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return." Enough has been written about the paradoxes contained in these lines, especially about the most obvious one. Why did God submit Adam and Eve to what is effectively a forced choice? Here is Stephen Greenblatt's version of the paradox, which even mentions Musk. Elon? Ancient commentators repeatedly asked why the God in the story have commanded Adam and Eve to not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, did not do more to prevent them from the disastrous act of disobedience. To be sure, the Creator warned them that the death would follow any violation of his prohibition. But how could the first humans have possibly understood what it meant to die? Why was the tree rooted in the very midst of the garden and not locked away? Why the way we lock away poison or nuclear waste? And how, before they had acquired knowledge of good and evil, could humans in their Edenic innocence have ever grasped the moral significance of what they were doing? Adam and Eve manifestly had insufficient knowledge of the long-term consequences of their actions, and God, who could have implanted this knowledge to them far more easily than Elon Musk proposed chips, evidently chose not to do so. More importantly, for our purposes, is the paradox of knowing. The serpent tells Eve that after eating the apple from the forbidden tree, you will be like God, knowing good and evil, and as Hegel notices, the serpent doesn't lie. God immediately confirms it, commenting that Adam and Eve are now like one of us. And let's ignore here the mysterious plural of gods. So how can eating the apple, which brings knowledge in divinity, throw the first humans into the misery of mortal life and ignorance? The standard explanation is, of course, that, by the way of imposing on them a hard choice, biased as it is, God is bestowing on the first humans their freedom, making them aware of their responsibility to choose between good and evil. Even the limitation of knowledge serves this purpose. If our knowledge is perfect, if all the details of the situation are clearly present in our mind, the choice is easy. But what makes a moral choice hard is precisely that we have to decide in a murky situation where the full burden of the decision is upon us. In the continuation of the quoted passage, Greenblatt provides a succinct version of this argument. Virtually all the early interpreters agreed that the Creator did not want to compromise the essential nature of humans by taking away their freedom of choice, freedom to choose, even though that freedom was the source of so much trouble and misery. If Adam and Eve knew everything that would follow from their actions, if they could make the inconceivably vast calculations that would give them, in Shakespeare's words, the future in an instant, they might have avoided their catastrophic blunder. But it would, the Genesis story suggests, have been at the cost of their humanity. This is not a celebration of ignorance or fecklessness. There was, after all, an explicit warning, however difficult it might have been for the first humans to interpret it correctly, and the consequences of the fateful choice were manifestly terrible. But the Bible represents humans neither as automata, the slaves of God, nor as miraculous sages endowed with all the knowledge they need to make the inevitably correct decisions. However, the central enigma remains: in what way does morality, knowing the difference between good and evil and acting upon it, imply ignorance, or at least a radical limitation of our knowledge? The philosopher who confronted this issue and provided the most consequent answer was Kant. When Kant says that he reduced the domain of knowledge in order to make space for religious faith, he is to be taken quite literally, in a radical anti-Spinozist way. From the Kantian perspective, Spinoza's position appears as a nightmarish vision of the subject, reduced to marionettes. What exactly does a marionette stand for as a subjective stance? In Kant, we find the term marionette in a mysterious subchapter in his Critique of Practical Reason, entitled "Of the Wise Adaptations of Man's Cognitive Faculties to His Practical Vocation," in which he endeavors to answer the question of what would happen to us if we were to gain access to the noumenal dimension, to the thing itself. Instead of the conflict which now the moral disposition has waged with inclinations, in which after some defeats, moral strengths of the mind may be gradually won, God and eternity in their awful majesty would stand unceasingly before our eyes. Thus, most actions conforming to the law would be done from fear. Few would be done from hope. None from duty. The moral worth of actions, on which alone the worth of man and even of the world depend in the eyes of wisdom, would not exist at all. The conduct of man, so long as his nature remained as it is, would be changed into mere mechanism, where, as in a puppet show, everything would gesticulate well, but no life would be found in the figures. So for Kant, direct access to the noumenal domain would deprive us of the very spontaneity which forms the kernel of transcendental freedom. It would turn us into lifeless automata, or, to put in today's terms, into thinking machines. And this is not ultimately presented as achievable in the future of singularity. The prospect of Neuralink is not to be dismissed as yet another ontic scientific research project of no authentic philosophical interest, since it offers something effectively new and unheard of that challenges our status of being human. The prospect of the actual empirical overcoming of our finitude or sexuality or embeddedness in the symbolic. Entering this other dimension of singularity becomes a simple positive fact, not a matter of sublime inner experience. What does this mean for the status of our subjectivity and for our self-experience? Can we imagine a form of self-awareness that would, at some level of selfless floating in the space of singularity? Insofar as I, a singular self, no longer exist in singularity, one possibility is to draw a parallel between the fate of the self in singularity and Buddhist enlightenment, in which the self directly experientially assumes its own non-being. Such an enlightened awareness is no longer self-awareness. It is no longer I who experience myself as the agent of my thoughts. My awareness is a direct awareness of the selfless system, a selfless knowledge. However, there is a difference between Buddhist enlightenment and singularity. In singularity, I do not acquire a distance towards my feelings in other experiences. I don't identify with the void that is the truth of appearance. I, on the contrary, fully immerse myself in the shared space of feelings in other experiences. There's a more fundamental concern with regard to the question of the fate of subjectivity and singularity. The innermost core of subjectivity resides in a unique act of what Fish baptizes self-positing. Here, each subject is a point of absolute autonomy, which means that it cannot be reduced to a moment in the network of cause and effects. In an act of self-relating that Hegel calls absolute recoil, it has to posit, retroactively, the very cause of its existence. This closed self-referential circle of the absolute recoil, in which the cause is a retroactive effect of its effects, is thus effectively a kind of realization of the famous joke about bootstrapping from the story of Baron Munchausen, who pulled himself and the horse on which he was sitting out of a swamp where he was drowning by pulling his hair up with his hands. In natural reality, such bootstrapping is of course impossible, a nonsensical paradox passable only as a joke. However, not only can it happen in the domain of spirit, but it is even the feature which defines a spirit. To be sure, the material base of this loop of self-positing remains. There is no spirit without matter. If we destroy the body, spirit vanishes. But the self-positing of spirit is not just some kind of user's illusion. It has an actuality of its own with actual effects. It is in this sense that Lacan claims at a conclusion of the analytical treatment, the subject is ready to conceive itself as a causua sui, its own cause. The cause of a subject is of course not an object in reality, but object the object cause of desire, which has no substandard reality. It is purely virtual X, which merely gives body to the void of desire. In our everyday life of desire, we fetishize and reify object i.e., we treat it as a real pre-existing cause of our desire. At the end of the treatment, what subjects realize that its cause is its own presupposition, retroactively posited by the subject itself as its effect. The paradox of absolute recoil is actualized here. The circle is closed as the effect posits its own cause. For a partisan of the so-called materialist theory of subjectivity, which insists on the subject as the effect of a pre-subjective material process, a process that cannot be reduced to the subject's self-mediation, this closure of the circle is the basic idealist illusion of selfish causation, the illusion that obfuscates the decentered process out of which a subject emerges. However, from a strict Lacanian Hegelian standpoint, this self-causation is not just a speculative idealist illusion. It designates a cut, an interruption in the real itself. The subject self-positing is idealist only if we define reality as a complex texture of causes and effects without any gaps or cuts. This is why Nietzsche was doubly wrong in his dismissive reference to Munchausen in Beyond Good and Evil. The desire for freedom of will, the desire to bear the existence and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself, involves nothing less than to pull oneself up into existence by the hair of the slough of nothingness. What Nietzsche rejects here is the self-positing, which in German idealism defines the subject, and it is our claim that one can interpret the act of self-positing also in a materialist way, although the consequences of this act are often quite paradoxical. Let's take a recent example. It was responded to in the media that Raphael Samuel, a citizen of India, said he would sue his parents for giving birth to him. In a wonderful display of what Anders calls Promethean shame, the shame of being born, thrown into the world and not self-manufactured, Samuel is telling people, especially Indian kids, that they don't owe their parents anything. He also claims that putting a child through institutions like school and the job market without their consent is wrong. We should not reject Samuel's complaint as ridiculous. There is a deep insight in it. We just have to avoid the confusion between the empirical and the transcendental levels. Empirically, I am of course thrown into the world. I don't choose my body. The culture in which I am educated as a child, however, to become a self, there has to be a transcendental act of self-positing, such as I have to assume my subjectivity in a minimally active way, and the question is, can this absolute act survive the immersion into singularity? I recently read a report on transgender individuals in Slovene daily newspapers whose title reproduces exactly the same paradox. Finally, I live in the body, into which I wanted to be born, as if prior to my birth, I had already have chosen my gender identity and my biological fate didn't respect my choice. This notion of unconscious reflexivity also resolves the problem of endless regress in grounding a normative order, which rules do we obey to ground our obeying the rules, or self-consciousness. When I am conscious of my consciousness, am I conscious of my being conscious of my consciousness, etc. ad infinitum? The solution is not a Fichtean one. In the absolute, I, pausing and being posited coincide. I posit myself as positing. Although it is strictly homogeneous to it, the solution is that this act of self-positing, the act through which, as Lacan put it, the subject acts as his own cause, is unconscious, always already presupposed by the conscious ego. Hegel called this circle of self-positing absolute recoil, the effect of a cause retroactively producing their own cause. What characterizes this materialist self-positing is that, in contrast to Fichtean idealist self-positing, it has the structure of a failure, which can be best illustrated by the loop of symbolic representation. A subject endeavors to represent itself adequately. This representation fails, and the subject is the result of this failure. Recall in this respect the Hugh Grant paradox. A hero tries to articulate his love to the beloved, stumbles and gets caught in its confused repetitions, and this is the very failure to deliver his message of love in a perfect way that bears witness to its authenticity. The subject is thus not just caught in the reflexivity of absolute recoil, it is nothing but this reflexivity. The notion of such an act of unconsciousness, self-positing, is more than an abstract rumination. It can help us resolve a tension of the dominant form of the LGBT+ ideology. Many observers notice a tension in LGBT ideology between social constructivism and some kind of biological determinism. If an individual biologically identified and perceived as man experiences himself in his psychic economy as man, it is considered a social construct. But if an individual biologically identified and perceived as a man experiences herself as a woman, this is read as an urge, not a simple arbitrary construct, but a deeper, non-negotiable identity, which, if the individual demands it, the demand has to be met by sex-changing surgery. The media in Slovenia reported that in a high school in Ljubljana, a progressive teacher organized a trip for the pupils to a big swimming pool and asked them there to cross-dress, boys wearing bras, etc. The obvious point of this experiment was to demonstrate that the children how gender identity is not a biological fact but a construct of social customs. However, I find it difficult to imagine a more ruthless and stupid experiment. Imagine among the pupils a biological boy who identifies psychically as a girl. I doubt he would feel relief as the fact that he or she can, for a moment, dress the way he feels appropriate to his true identity. Would the experiment not rather remind him of the fact that his identity is not simply the result of how he dresses? A traumatic cross-dressing, a girl obliged to dress as a boy, is his or her daily life. Along the same lines, kindergartens in Norway were told that if a small boy is seen playing with girls, this orientation should be supported. He should be stimulated to play with dolls, etc., so that his eventual feminine psychic identity can articulate itself. The solution here is rather simple. Yes, psychic sexual identity is a choice, not a biological fact, but it is not a conscious choice that the subject can playfully repeat and transform. It is an unconscious choice which precedes subjective constitution, in which, as such, formative of subjectivity, which means that a change of this choice entails the radical transformation of one who makes it. In short, this choice is a case of unconscious acts of self-positing. The fall is the theological name for such an unconscious choice. It designates the wound of separation of the constitutive loss, which characterizes our being human as finite and sexed. Musk and other proponents of Neuralink wants to heal the wound literally, to fill the gap with having men united with God by making him a godlike, i.e. by way of providing him with the properties and capacities which we till now experience as the divine. What makes this option properly traumatic is that it turns around the gap that separates our ordinary daily experience from sublime speculation about our proximity to God. When someone talks about experiencing unity with God, a realist tells him to calm down. Don't get lost in your dreams. Remember that you are still rooted in this miserable earthly reality. But with the prospect of singularity, the reply to this realist view is easy. We are the true realist. We can provide divine immortality in our empirical reality. It is you who still believes that our material morality is the ultimate horizon of our being, that is effectively dreaming. You cling to the old notion of reality, ignoring the big breakthrough. Our wager is that here, at this point where Fichte and Hegel seem totally out of date and out of touch with our contemporaneity, we have to return to them. More precisely, we have to circle back to Hegel's reading of the fall if we want to be moved beyond mere fascination by the prospect of singularity and really think about what is going on here. As we have already seen, some proponents of singularity read it in a Hegelian way, as the final reconciliation between mind and reality, as the healing of the wound of the fall. However, such a reading is totally incompatible with Hegel's interpretation of the fall. According to the standard reading of Paul, God gave law to humanity in order to make people conscious of their sins, even to make them sin all the more, and thus make them aware of their need for salvation, which can occur only through divine grace. But does this reading not involve a strange, perverse notion of God? The only way to avoid such a perverse reading is to insist on the absolute identity of the two gestures. God does not first push us into sin in order to create the need for salvation and then offer himself as the Redeemer from the trouble into which he got us in the first place. It is not that the fall is followed by redemption. The fall is identical to redemption. It is in itself already redemption. That is to ask, what is redemption? The exposition of freedom, or breaking out of the natural enchainment, and this precisely is what happens in the fall. One should bear in mind here the central tension of the Christian notion of the fall, regression to a natural state, enslavement to passions, is stricto sensu identical with the dimension from which we fall, i.e. it is the very movement of the fall that opens up what is lost in it. We all know Wagner's motif. Only the spear that struck the wound can heal it. From the finale of his Parsifal, Hegel says the same thing, though with the accent shifted in the opposite direction. Spirit is itself the wound it tries to heal. The wound is self-inflicted. That is to ask, what is spirit at its most elementary? The wound of nature. Subject is the immense absolute power of negativity, of introducing a gap or a cut into the given immediate substantial unity, the power of differentiating, of abstracting, of tearing apart and treating as self-scanning what in reality is part of an organic unity. This is why the notion of self-alienation of spirit losing itself in its otherness, in its objectivization, in its result, is more paradoxical than it may appear. It should be read together with Hegel's assertion of the thoroughly non-substantial character of spirit. There is no res cogitans, no thing which as its property also thinks spirit is nothing but the process of overcoming natural immediacy, of the cultivation of this immediacy, or withdrawing it into itself, or taking off from it, of why not alienating itself from it. The paradox is thus that there is no self that precedes spirit's self-alienation. The very process of alienation creates and generates the self from which spirit is alienated, into which it then returns. Hegel here turns around the standard notion that a failed version of X presupposes that X is its norm or measure. X is created, its space is outlined, only through a repetitive failure to reach it. Spirit's self-alienation is the same as, fully coincides with, its alienation from its other nature, because it constitutes itself through its return to itself from its immersion in natural otherness. In other words, spirit returns to itself, creates the very dimension to which it returns. This holds for all returns of origins, when from the 19th century onwards, new nation-states were constituted themselves in Central and Eastern Europe. Their discovery and return to old ethnic roots generated these roots. What this means is that the negation of the negation, the return to oneself from alienation, does not occur where it seems to. In the negation of the negation, spirit's negativity is not real relativized, subsumed under an encompassing positivity. It is, on the contrary, the simple negation which remains attached to the presupposed positivity it negated, the presupposition, otherness, from which it alienates itself. It follows that the negation of the negation is nothing but the negation of the substantial character of this otherness itself, the full acceptance of the abyss of spirit's self-relating, which retroactively posits all its presuppositions. In other words, once we are in negativity, we never quit it and regain the lost innocence of origins. It is only in negation of the negation that the origins are truly lost, that their very loss is lost, that they are deprived of the substantial status of which was lost. Spirit's wounds heals its wounds not by directly healing it, but by getting rid of the very full, insane body into which the wound was cut. It is this precise sense that, according to Hegel, the wound of the spirit heals and leaves no scars behind. Hegel's point is not that spirit heals its wounds so perfectly that in a magical gesturing of retroactive sublation, even their scars disappears. The point is rather that, in the course of dialectical process, a shift of perspective occurs which makes the wound itself appear as its opposite. The wound itself is its own healing when perceived from another standpoint. At its sharpest, this coincidence of opposites appears apropos self-consciousness, i.e. the subject as thinking. Abstractly, being evil means singularizing myself in a way that cuts me off from the universal, which is the rational, the laws, the determinations of spirit. But along the separation from there arises being for itself, and for the first time, the universally spiritual laws, what ought to be. So it is not the case that rational consideration has an external relationship to evil. It is itself what evil is. This brings us to Genesis. Does this story of the fall not say exactly the same thing? The serpent promises Adam and Eve that by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they will become like God. And after they do it, God says, Behold, Adam has become like one of us. Hegel comments, so the serpent did not lie, for God confirms what is said. He then goes on to reject the claim that what God said is meant with irony. Cognition is the principle of spirituality, and this is also the principle by which the injury of the serpent of the separation is healed. It is in this principle of cognition that the principle of divinity is also posited. It is crucial to follow Hegel's entire line of argumentation that here, and not to miss the audacity of his point. To read this passage together with one in which he asserts the subjective knowledge is not just the possibility of to choose evil or good, it is the consideration of the cognition that makes people evil, so that the consideration and cognition themselves are what is evil, and that therefore such cognition is what ought not to exist, because it is the source of evil. In short, what makes us divine is our very fall into evil, since thinking is both at the same time evil and reconciliation. Hegel is clear here. Thinking not only opens up the choice between good and evil, but thinking as such is evil, since the reflexivity that it implies makes it operate at a distance from immediate substantial unity. When we think, we abstract. We tear up the unity of the object of thought. Simultaneously, this reflexive distance implies freedom. In our thoughts we are free, formally at least. This is how one should understand Hegel's dictum from his phenomenology, that evil is the gaze itself which perceives evil everywhere around it. The gaze that sees evil excludes itself from the social whole it criticizes, and this exclusion is a formal characteristic of evil. And Hegel's point is that good emerges from a possibility and duty only through this primordial constitutive choice of evil. We experience the good only when, after choosing evil, we become aware of the utter inadequacy of our situation. Path-breaking as it is, one should say that Hegel's reading of Genesis is too short at two connected topics, and the reason is not that Hegel was too much of a prisoner of his time to see the dimensions he missed. Much more, paradoxically, in both cases, Hegel is here not Hegelian enough, as he fails to follow a properly Hegelian twist. First, he characterizes an evil person. Hegel reduces evil to a movement of a particularity in its opposition to universality, natural egotism, selfish behavior, etc. This is why, as Hegel points out, every consistent figure of evil has to display some feature of goodness. As one would expect, Hegel mentions the devil from Milton's Paradise Lost, who is obviously a figure of great personal power, pursuing a project that he experiences as profoundly ethical. But was not on this point Shelley, on his Essence of Human Freedom, much more profound when he decoded in Evil a principled, non-pathological and Kant's stance, which is as such radically spiritual? True evil has nothing to do with particular egotism and selfish interest. It is a positive spiritual project for which people are ready to even sacrifice their lives, as Nazis did in order to exterminate the Jews, or dedicated Stalinist communists did in order to crush Trotskyist or Kulak resistance. If Hegel were to be fully consistent with the core of his own thought, he would have said that that the good itself is nothing but universalized evil, the evil which wins over others and acquires the position of universality. Therein resides also Hegel's critique of abstract universality. For him, French revolutionaries were evil in their terror precisely because they thought principled and ruthlessly pursued a universality which ultimately excludes all particular content. So when particular content is not reconciled with universality, the fault is even more on the side of abstract universality. This brings us to the second of Hegel's limitations, which is even more important for our concern. When Hegel characterizes evil as Entzweigung, as separation or self-division of the absolute, he quietly ignores in his reading of the fall the key that, when the absolute is opposed to the fallen particularity, true guilt and responsibility are on the side of the absolute itself. What Hegel should have said, since it follows clearly from the inner logic of his thought, is that, in all the affairs of the fall, the truly evil character is God himself, who pushes the first humans into the fall, and what makes things even worse is that instead of doing it openly, he, as it were, washes his hands and presents the fall as a consequence of a free human decision. This is why Christianity culminates in crucifixion, a scene in which Entzweigung, which for Hegel formally defines evil, is directly and explicitly transposed from the split between God and humans into God himself, who with the terrifying moment of Father, why have you abandoned me, is split from himself. The category to be used apropos, this displacement of the gap that separates us from God to a gap that separates God from himself is disparity, a term which occurs 3 times in a key passage from the preface to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, where he provides the most concise explanation of what it means to conceive substance as the subject. The disparity which exists in consciousness between the I and the substance which is its object is the distinction between them and the negative in general. This can be regarded as the defect of both, though it is their soul or that which moves them. This is why some of the ancients conceived the void as a principle of motion, for they rightly saw the moving principle as the negative, though they did not yet grasp that this negative is the self. Now, although this negative appears at first as a disparity between the I and its object, it is just as much the disparity of the substance with itself. Thus, what seems to happen outside of it to be an activity directed against it is really its own doing, and substance shows itself to be essentially subject. Crucial is the final reversal. The disparity between subject and substance is simultaneously the disparity of the substance with itself, or, to put it in Lacan's terms, disparity means that the lack of the subject is simultaneously a lack in the other. Subjectivity emerges when substance cannot achieve full identity with itself, when substance is in itself barred, traversed by an imminent possibility or antagonism. In short, the subject's epistemological ignorance, its failure to grasp the opposite substantial content, simultaneously indicates a limitation, a failure, a lack of the substantial content itself. Therein also resides a key dimension of teleological revolution in Christianity. The alienation of humanity from God has to be projected and transferred back into God himself, as the alienation of God from himself. Therein resides the speculative content of the notion of divine kenosis. This is the Christian version of Hegel's insight into how the disparity of subject and substance implies the disparity of substance with regards to itself. This is why the unity of human and God is enacted in Christianity in a way which fundamentally differs from the way of pagan religions, where humans have to strive to overcome their fall from God through the effort of purifying their being from material filth and elevating themselves to rejoin God. In Christianity, on the contrary, God falls from himself. He becomes a finite mortal human abandoned by God in the figure of Christ in his lament on the cross, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" And the human beings can only achieve unity with God by identifying with this God abandoned by himself. Again, in his reading of Genesis, Hegel ignores this aspect. He only talks about the separation of man from God and fails to mention that the reconciliation of God and man is also primarily even the reconciliation of God with himself. It is only through reconciliation with humans that God truly becomes God in the true concrete universality of this notion. So reconciliation between God and humanity is a key event in and for God himself. However, Hegel's main insight remains fully valid and pertinent. For Hegel, we humans reach immortality and affinity not by way of undoing the fall, by way of somehow getting rid of the obstacle of our finite bodily existence and moving to another dimension of some higher reality, but by way of reconciling ourselves with what appears as the obstacle and acceptance that this obstacle plays a positive role of sustaining the space of what it appears as the obstacle to. Reconciliation does not consist in overcoming the obstacle, but asserting it in its positive role. At the level of political and social change, this means that we should abandon any extrapolation of non-alienated future from present tendencies. Such a mode of thinking, the logic of now we are at a moment of utter alienation and the possibilities open for us to act as agents of overcoming alienation, is utterly foreign to Hegel, who repeatedly emphasizes the retroactive nature of overcoming alienation. We overcome alienation by realizing that we've already overcome it. In other words, nothing really changes in overcoming alienation. We just shift our perspective and gain this insight into how what appears as alienation is the imminent condition of disalienation. It is in itself already disalienation. This is in the sense that in his small logic, Hegel proposes his own version of La vérité surgit de la méprise, ambiguously asserting that only from this error does the truth come forth. In the sphere of the finite, we can neither experience nor see that the purpose is genuinely attained. The accomplishing of the infinite purpose consists therefore only in sublating the illusion that there has not yet been accomplished. The good, the absolute good, fulfills itself eternally in the world, and the result is what is already fulfilled in and for itself, and does not need to wait upon us for this to happen. This is the illusion in which we live, and at the same time, it is the illusion alone that is activating element upon which our interests in the world rest. It is within its own process that the idea produces the illusion for itself. It posits on the other confronting itself, and its actions consist in sublating that illusion. Only for this error does the truth come forth, and herein lies our reconciliation with error and finitude. Otherness or error, as sublated, is itself a necessary moment of the truth, which can only be in that it makes itself into its own result. In short, the ultimate deception is not to see that one already has what it looks for, what one is looking for Christ's disciples who were awaiting his real reincarnation, blind to the fact that their collective already was the Holy Spirit, the return of the living Christ. To understand this process of necessary illusion, we have to take a step closer, look at the structure of temporality that is implied here. Let's take a perhaps surprising example from the operatic universe. Towards the end of Act 1 of Donizetti's masterpiece, Elixir d'Amour, there is a passage which exemplifies in a musical way the basic thrust of the Hegelian Offenbung, sublation or retroactive repositioning. It is basically a trio sustained by a chorus. The love triangle is composed of Adina, a beautiful and wealthy farm owner, Nimenora, a simpleton who deeply loves her, and Belcor, an arrogant and boasting surgeon who also wants to marry Adina. Upon hearing the news that Adina is ready to marry Belcor the same evening, Nimenor entreats her to postpone that marriage, and Belcor brutally tells him to fuck off. This heaven dolt, are you mad or drunk with wine? I would have choked you, reduced to shreds, if at this moment you were yourself, so that I can keep my hands under control. Go away, fool. Hide from me. The magic, of course, resides in how the simple exchange is put into music. The most impressionable phrase, va via buffon ti ascondi a me, to be translated as Casi toi pavre con, or fuck off, jerk, is first sung in an aggressive mode, but is later repositioned as the background of the predominant love duet. Consequently, at the end of this trio, peace and reconciliation are already achieved, although none of the participants knows it. What interests us here is the strange intermediate time when, as the form suggests, things are already decided, even if the participants are still engaged in their struggles. Are there not moments of pure bliss? Not in the sense that there's no conflict, but in the sense that the conflict which goes on is already going on within the space of reconciliation. We also encounter such an intermediate time in the epochs of political turmoil. When in Venezuela, Guaido proclaimed himself the only legitimate president with the vast international support, and when this act triggered a renewed wave of public protest in his support, he declared on February 7, 2019, the Maduro regime, are already defeated. Today our only enemy is despair. Today our only enemy is doubt. Today our only enemy is fear. But while Guaido presents the situation as already decided, things are more complex. The situation is more uncertain. Maduro was often dismissed as already dead, but was till now able to weather every crisis. The only way to correctly describe the situation is thus if at the end of the day, Guaido wins and Maduro's regime collapses. Then, we will retroactively be able to say that the game was over long before. Once the collapse contingently happens, we can state that it already happened and that it was necessary for it to happen. The intermediate period thus extends between the two cuts. Things are gradually changing in reality. The existing regime is undermined because we act under the premise that essentially it is already lost, that its time is over. At a certain point, this premise is then fully asserted in reality, and that the existing order effectively collapses. The logic of things changes because they have already changed and lost their substantial truth. Has to be supplemented by its apparent opposite. Things gradually change at the material level, and this change is subterranean, like the secret spreading of a deadly infection, when the struggle erupts into the open, and the mole has already finished its work and the battle is de facto over. Here is Hegel's description of this process apropos the struggle of enlightenment against the traditional religious spirit. The gradual extension of the pure enlightenment, insight of enlightenment is comparable to a silent extension of the explanation, say of a secret sent in the unresisting atmosphere. It is a penetrating infection which did not previously make itself noticeable as something distinct from and opposed to the indifferent mediums into which it insinuates its way, and hence cannot be averted. Only when the infection has become widespread is that the consciousness alive to it, which unconcerned yielding to its influence, and the condition therefore in its own consciousness becomes aware of the pure insight. This insight is already widespread. The struggle with it betrays the fact that the infection has done its work. The struggle is too late, and every means merely makes the disease worse, for the disease has seized the very marrow of spiritual life. Being now an invisible and unperceived spirit, it insinuates its way through the noble parts, and soon has got completely bowled over all the vitals and members of the unconscious idol, and then some fine morning it gives its comrade a shove with the elbow, when, bash, crash, the idol is lying on the floor. We all know the classic scene from cartoons. The cast reaches a precipice, but it goes on walking, ignoring the fact that there are no grounds under its feet, and starts to fall only when it looks down and notices the abyss. When it loses its authority, the regime is like a cat above the precipice. In order to fall, it only has to be reminded to look down. But the opposite also holds. When an authoritarian regime approaches its final crisis, its dissolution as a rule follows two steps. Before its actual collapse, a mysterious rupture takes place. All of a sudden, people know the game is over, and they are simply no longer afraid. It is not only that the regime loses its legitimacy, but its exercise of power itself is perceived as impotent panic reaction. In Shaw's A Classic Account of the Khomeni Revolution, Ryszard Kashpushinki located the precise moment of this rupture. At a Tehran crossroad, a single demonstrator refused to budge when a policeman shouted at him to move, and the embarrassed policeman simply withdrew. In a couple hours, all Tehran knew about this incident and thought there were street fightings going on for weeks. Everyone knew the game was over. Falling in love is characterized by the same temporal gap. In one of Henry James' stories, the hero says about a woman close to him she already loves him, so she doesn't know it yet. What we find here is a kind of Freudian counterpart to Benjamin Libet's famous experiment about free will. Even before we consciously decide, say, to move a finger, the appropriate neuronal process are already underway. What means that our consciousness decision just takes note of what is already going on, adding its superfluous authorization to a fait accompli. With Freud, decision is also prior to consciousness. However, it is not a purely objective process, but an unconscious decision. Freud here rejoins Schelling, for whom also a true free decision is unconscious, which is why we never fall in love in the present time. After a usually long process of subterranean gestation, we all of a sudden become aware that we are already in love. Like the fall into love never happens at a certain moment. It was always already happened. To put it yet another way, freedom does not yet reside in your ability to resist when you suffer. That kind of resistance comes by nature. Freedom is beginning to enjoy when you suffer. In June 2019, the Greater Manchester Police arrested a 93-year-old Josie Birds, despite the fact that she committed no crimes, because it was her dying wish. Her health was failing, and she wanted to be arrested for something before it's too late, and taken to one of the police stations so she could experience what it's like to be on the wrong side of the law. This request was an act of freedom if there ever was one. And at this level, we can formulate the difference between Sartre and Lacan. For Sartre, the basic free act, by means of which a subject chooses itself, formulates the existential project that defines its identity. It is an act of self-consciousness. For him, the unconscious is a substantial reified entity, something that objectively determines me. For Lacan, on the contrary, a primordial choice is unconscious, since the unconscious is not a substantial determination of the subject, but the most basic level of reflexivity.